Good morning and welcome again to Stella Maris Academy. I'm Gavin Colvert, the head of school here, and we're pleased to present a second conversation about Catholic classical education and all of the wonderful things that are happening at our school. I'd like to introduce this morning Greg Meck, who is a parent and a member of our steering committee on our board. Greg is also in the tech field. He's a senior engineer at Facebook. And he's going to be talking this morning about fulfilling the promise of STEM, Catholic classical education. So Greg, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Gavin, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you all virtually. Although, I wish that we could be in person. It's still nice that we do have technology to be able to connect, at least in a virtual way, with you all. And so today I'm going to be talking about fulfilling the promise of STEM. And here's our rough agenda. First, we're going to talk through what is the promise of STEM? What is it and why does it matter? Second, how do we achieve the promise of STEM? That's not an immediately obvious thing. And so we'll talk through, how do we actually accomplish what it is we're trying to accomplish? And then thirdly, I'll talk through why I think that classical education is our best hope for actually being able to fulfill that promise of STEM. It actually is somewhat weird. When I have a bunch of colleagues that I interact with at Facebook and they say, where are you sending your children? And I say, oh, I'm sending them to a classical school. It's almost always very surprising to them. But you're in technology and you do something classical. But I truly do believe that it is the best option to be able to fulfill the promise of STEM. And so we'll talk through that. So first thing we've got then, what is the promise of STEM? And in order to be able to talk about that, first we really need to say, what is STEM? STEM. Does anybody know that off the top of its head? It's kind of a weird acronym. It stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They've been bundled together into a single unit, and we talk about them collectively because of how much they interact with each other. STEM, in particular, has been taking over, to a very large extent, the job market. So in the next 10 years, for example, we expect the growth in STEMy jobs to be about 2x the growth of everything else. And that means that, this is something that is extremely important to us as a society because we are willing to pay more people to do it. Incidentally, as well, it turns out that around STEM workers today earn about 26% more in their salaries than non-STEM workers do. Where are those jobs coming from? The vast majority of the growth in STEM jobs is coming from computing, roughly around 70% of things. And this is because, as the famous venture capitalist Mark Andreessen says, software is eating the world. We know this, I think, in an intuitive way, almost in the Bay Area, because this is the center of the tech world in that regard. And what Mark Andreessen means when he says that software is eating the world is that software is no longer a separate industry. Software is actually something that has permeated into every single industry that exists. If you don't have software that is powering your business, you tend to be behind the times. And so it actually is important for almost any industry that you're going to be working in to be able to understand, interact with STEM people, and that's where most of the growth is. The other thing I wanted to point out is to give you a sense of how significant some of the work here is, education takes a lot of time. If your children were to start school this year in kindergarten, they're going to finish their high school education 13 years from now. Technology moves incredibly fast. To give you a sense of this, 13 years ago today, there was no iPhone in the world. It had not yet been introduced. Which means by the time your kids finish school, there could be another technological revolution that has actually taken place. And our society seems to just be continually increasing in that regard. And so we really want to make sure that our kids are equipped to be able to live in this highly evolving world. Which then is the thing that all of my coworkers immediately try to push me on. So you're sending your kids to a classical academy. If technology is going to be so key to our children's future, can we really afford to have an antiquated education model, which is developed under people who had no notion of computing? I mean, after all, the images that we use to illustrate classical education, usually things like this. A stone bust of somebody like Aristotle. Isn't that the basis of antiquated? My answer to this question, ironically enough, is yes. It is something that is key. I think that if we want our kids to be as successful as they can in areas of technology, not only technology, but also technology, we really want to provide them with the best liberal arts education that we can. Let's talk a little bit about why. How is it that we can achieve the promise of STEM? STEM really promises to be able to continue to advance our society with technology. What do we need in order to be able to have that happen? The first thing we really want to talk about in this regard is what is technology and what is computing? In this regard, I find the most helpful definition comes from Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is, one of the pioneers of how we are successful in the technology industry. And he described this way. He said, I think one of the things that really separates us from high primates is that we're tool builders. I read a study that measured the efficiency of locomotion of various species on the planet. The condor used the least energy to move a kilometer, and humans came in with a rather unimpressive showing, about a third of the way down the list. It was not too proud of a showing for the crown of creation, so that doesn't look good. But then somebody at Scientific America had the insight to test the efficiency of locomotion for a man on a bicycle. And a man on a bicycle, a human on a bicycle, blew away the condor, completely off the charts. And that's what a computer is to me, Steve Jobs says. What a computer is to me is it's the most remarkable tool that we have ever come up with, and it's the equivalent of a bicycle for our minds. Now, for those of you who are Catholic or Christian in a general sense, I think some of the things that Steve Jobs says here is amazing how it accords with our understanding of the nature of reality. He basically says we're an animal, and he's going to compare us to the other animals, but we are a rational animal. What is the principle which differentiates us from the condor and all of the other animals? It's really not our animality. It's our rational intellect. Whereas all of the other animals depend upon the ability to move fast in their animality, we are able to contemplate the truth and the good and say, I want to do better, and so therefore we come up with tools. Compared to the other animals in our animality, we're not that impressive. But when you include our rationality, nothing in the kingdom can compare. And then he says, what is it that technology or computers are? Computers are the equivalent of a bicycle for our mind. If we truly understand how then to treat them, that's going to be according to their essence there. We have to treat them as a bicycle, which enables us to do the things that we want to be able to do in our rationality. So if we want to take advantage of that, take that definition, bicycle for our minds. What do we have to consider? If computers are bicycles for our mind, how then can we make the most of them? I would propose actually Aristotle might be of a little help for us here. Here's what Aristotle says. Virtue, or perfecting the actions that we want to do, then is a habit or trained faculty of choice, the characteristic which lies in moderation of the observance of the mean, relatively to the persons concerned, as determined by reason, i.e. by the reason by which the prudent man would determine it. Kind of heady here, right? And it is moderation, firstly, inasmuch as it comes to the middle or the mean between the two vices, on one side of excess and the other on the side of defect. All right, that's kind of hard, right? What is it that Aristotle is really saying here? He's saying virtue is a habit for us. It's a disposition by which we are disposed towards something. And what is it? It's a virtue which disposes us to the mean, between the extremes, with respect to some action or emotion. And so when we come to make use of technology, if we want to be virtuous in it, if we want to take it to its proper end, we need to consider what is the excess and what is the too smallness of it. The deficiency, if you will. Let's start with the deficiency. If we want to fulfill the promise of STEM, what do we need to avoid in its defect? And here, I think the most obvious thing is that if computing is the bicycle for the mind, we really need to avoid throwing out the bike. This is especially hard, I think, for those of us of a conservative traditional persuasion. When new things come into the world, we see all of the bad effects that come out of them, and we go, oh no, I'm not so sure about that. I should really get rid of it. In the extreme, you end up as the Amish, right? But you can be somewhat Luddite. You're going, I don't want to be able to make use of this technology because I'm afraid of the effects that come out of it. This ultimately is a deficiency. And if we're going to fulfill the promise of STEM, we can't do that. Let me give you an example here. All right, we want our children to have the best possible things. On the top of this slide here, we have a person who's running. On the bottom, we have somebody who's on a bike. And I would ask you, who's going to win in a race? Well, let's see. Yeah, the bike was significantly faster, right? Technology in that regard is a bike for our children's minds. We don't want to put them at a significant disadvantage by telling them, you run while all of your peers are riding the bike. And the reality of the matter is here too, if we're being honest, it's not a bike. It's a race car. And if we're telling our kids that they need to run while a person's in a race car, they're going to have a really hard time competing. And technology really does come with a lot of virtues. Technology puts information at our children's fingertips which previous generations could only dream of. I'll give you an example. I go to Google, I type in church fathers, enter, boom, I have them all there. I go, okay, what does the Bible say about justice? Boom, it's there. Do you know how long it would have taken somebody to be able to look up where are all the places in the Bible that mentions justice? 100 years ago, 50 years ago. We have all of that at our fingertips, and it is a tool that allows the mind to move at extreme speed. Not only that, it gives us access to community, which we wouldn't have had access to before. I know Facebook is a scary place, I work there, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. Let me just give you two examples of this sort of community. About a year and a half ago, I was wanting to learn to pray the way that the church prays. And I ended up in this group, Breviary and Divine Office Discussion Group. And I found a community of people that pray the Liturgy of the Hours or the Divine Office every day and sit and discuss it. In this regard, I almost, ended up with a monastery with an abbot who's saying, here's the way you can do it without leaving my house. And my family now is able to play the Liturgy of the Hours and learn from experts. Here's another example. This is a group that I frequent quite on a regular basis, Thomism Discussion Group. A little bit of a Thomist, a little bit. One of the things I love about this is the number of times people will ask a question in a book that they are reading on theology, and the person who wrote the book will answer them. 50 years ago, you wanted to ask the person who was an expert? Your host. There's no way you have access, but technology is granting them that access. We can't afford to throw out the bicycle. We need to give our kids not only the ability to use the technology, but to use it to its fullest and its best, and actually to develop further tools. You know, one of the things I've noticed in industry in this regard is the set of people who think as traditional Christians and say, what are the tools that we need in order to further the end for which we are made, is so limited. We need experts in that, in these fields. We can't throw out the bicycle, we need to push them onto it. But what then is the excess? Well, on the other side, if the bicycle, or if computing is a bicycle for the mind, the excess is actually to imagine that computing is more than a bicycle. To imagine that it is more than a tool. A way for us to live in harmony, better harmony with the created world. Rather, there are many who consider technology as a way for us to reimagine what we wished the world was, and then try to force the world to be that way. Technology in the excess tries to become the integrating principle of all education. And it offers itself as a means to the salvation of our problems. Well, any Christian who starts hearing the means to salvation is going to start going, yeah, there's a problem here, right? I think Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict XVI, captured this really well. He said, in order to find an answer to this, we must take a look at the foundations of the modern age. These appear with particular clarity in the thought of Francis Bacon. That a new era emerged through the discovery of America and the new technological achievements that had made this development possible is undeniable. But what is the basis of this new era? It is the new correlation of experiment and method that enables man to arrive at an interpretation of nature in conformity with its laws, and thus to finally achieve the, quote, triumph of art over nature. The novelty, he says, according to Bacon's vision, lies in a new correlation between science and praxis. This also is given a theological application. The new correlation between science and praxis would mean that the dominion over creation, given to man by God and lost through original sin, would be reestablished. Anyone who reads and reflects on these statements attentively will recognize that a disturbing step has been taken. Up to that time, the recovery of what man had lost through the expulsion of paradise was expected from faith in Jesus Christ. Herein lay redemption. Now, this redemption, the restoration of the lost paradise, is no longer expected from faith, but from the newly discovered link between science and praxis. Let me make that a little bit more concrete for you in relation to education. Have you ever heard things like, what we really need to improve our children's education is more technology in the classroom? The solution is technology. If we could just put an iPad into the hand of every student and get them where they were using that more fully, all of our problems would disappear. So long as they had high-speed internet, you know. The thing is that the world as a whole is realizing that part's not true too. This is actually a magazine review from the MIT Technology Review. There's an article which says this: how classroom technology is holding students back. Educators love digital devices, but there's little evidence that they help children, especially those who most need help. Why is that? Because they're not the end which education is moving towards. They're a means to acquire a particular good. I think we've learned this to an extreme almost in this pandemic, where all of our kids have been strapped to the computer with Zoom. I would ask you, has that been a good experience for them? I think all of us know, no, technology is not the salvation, if you will, in that regard. Benedict XVI actually continues a little bit later in his encyclical, and he says this: Francis Bacon and those who followed in the intellectual current of modernity that he inspired were wrong to believe that man would be redeemed through science. Such an expectation asks too much of science. This kind of hope is deceptive. Science can contribute greatly to making the world and mankind more human, yet it also can destroy mankind and the world unless it is steered by forces that lie outside of it. Let me break that down a little bit for you and draw your attention to a couple things in here. The first thing that he says is such an expectation asks too much of science. Why does it ask too much of science or technology or computing and all of those sorts of things? Because, going back to speaking of Steve Jobs, right? What is a computer? A bicycle for the mind. A bicycle is not your salvation. A bicycle is somewhere that helps you get to places faster. It needs instruction from something outside of it in order to be able to know where to go. Technology is not the end in and of itself. And in fact, when you hope in technology to be the thing that will solve all of the problems for your children's education, that hope is deceptive. It will let you down. It's like somebody telling you, throw the ball up in the air, don't worry, it won't fall. There are laws which govern reality, and when we buck and fight against those laws, we are the ones who end up hurt. The other thing which Pope Benedict says in the second half of this quote is that science can contribute greatly to making the world and mankind more human. Yet, at the same time, it can also destroy mankind and the world unless it is steered by forces that lie outside of it. Technology, when it is used according to its purpose as a tool, as a bike for you to ride on with your mind, is going to make things so much better. You're going to have access to all of the information you want at your fingertips. You can create community that you wouldn't be able to create otherwise, but it must be governed by something outside of it. I'll give you a single example of this. I think Pope Benedict XVI would be particularly sensitive to this topic. The Nazis were great technologists. I mean, the Holocaust, to a large extent, is a technological marvel. There was tons of innovation in technology that enabled them to kill more people, which ultimately just makes it a greater tragedy. Technology in and of itself cannot tell you where to go. And if you try to exalt technology to the place where it lives at the center, it is the integrating principle of your thought, of your education. Ultimately, it has the potential not only to make things better, but to destroy it. Technology cannot be the integrating principle. We can't put it at the center of our children's education. And it's not enough in that regard to put it at the center and try to sprinkle ethics or religion or any other things around the outside as separate disciplines to ensure the success of our technological revolution. Rather, if we want to make our technology successful, to be the end and the good which Pope Benedict speaks of, we have to put it in its proper place as a tool to achieve an end outside of itself. We must focus our efforts first on the nature of reality, understanding it in its fullness, enjoying all that God has made in it. And then, out of that, be able to talk about how we use technology as a means to achieve the flourishing which creation tells us. By the way, this is what all successful technology does. Let's go back to the two examples I said, Google, Facebook. What does Google do? What made Google successful in its technology? It didn't start with, I need to exalt the technology. It started with understanding the problem that exists. There is information that exists in the world, and we want to have better access to it. They started with the world, understanding the things that exist in it, and then said, how do I make a tool to give better access to that? Same things. What does Facebook do? Facebook takes social interactions which exist in the real world and creates a tool. You see, it starts with the world. It doesn't start with technology. In this sense, if we want our children to flourish in the world of technology, then we must ground their education first in the liberal arts. We teach them to understand the world as it is in itself, not as we wish it could be. We form them into virtuous people who then, on account of that virtue, can craft the potencies present in creation to further communicate human flourishing through tools like technology. We cannot allow STEM to become the end if we want to fulfill the promise of it. We must keep it as a means. Let's talk then, briefly, about why is classical education, I think, our best hope to achieve that. And I have 3 reasons. First, classical education aims at the flourishing of the whole person. It's a wonderful book entitled The Liberal Arts Tradition, A Philosophy of Christian Education. And in it, it points this out. It says, since human beings are more than just intellects, the curriculum must develop more than just intellectual virtue. Creatures formed in God's image must be cultivated in body and soul, or mind, will, and affections. If we want our children to be able to be successful at shaping technology, we need them first to be in control of themselves. That's not something that comes natural to any of our children. They need to discipline their body. They need to discipline their mind. They need to think in the way in which God intended us to think. And so they need to be trained in the totality of the virtues. And we need to teach them how to think, starting from first principles in that regard. Virtue and virtue alone liberates one to be able to pursue the end which they want. Hence, by the way, liberal arts. The intention of classical education is to liberate our children, not from the world, but for the world. Second, classical education equips the mind through the wisdom of the ages. Here's a quote from Bill Gates that I thought was ever so poignant. He said this recently: "Ever since I was a teenager, I've tackled every big new problem the same way, by starting off with 2 questions. I used this technique at Microsoft, and I still use it today. I ask these questions literally every week about COVID-19. Here they are. 1, who has dealt with this problem well? 2, what can we learn from them?" If you want to succeed and flourish in life, Bill Gates says you have to be humble enough to say, let me ask the rest of the world. I would say that that particularly applies in a Christian context. We need to not be arrogant to think that we are the first people to ever run into the problems that we are running into. Joseph Pearce, one of the folks from the Augustine Institute, describes this problem this way. We live in a pathetically dumbed down culture. Levels of literacy and numeracy plummet and levels of ignorance rise. Knowledge of the past disappears, its lessons unlearned, as the present shows its contempt for the wisdom of the ages and its sages. In short and in sum, to put the matter bluntly, we live in an age that is characterized by the arrogance of ignorance, which knows nothing, but is certain nonetheless that it is smarter than every age that preceded it. 5 minutes with Homer, Sophocles, or Plato and Socrates could show us that we know less than we think. Or for that matter, 5 minutes with Dante or Shakespeare, or a few minutes with the inimitable Miss Austen. The problem is that we no longer spend any time with these paragons of wisdom, and we certainly don't spend time with them at school, from which they have been unceremoniously banished. I mean, put these 2 things together. Bill Gates says, if you want to be successful, what you really need is to understand the people who have solved this problem beforehand. And we've said, we're in the superior age. I'm going to choose to be ignorant purposefully. Classical education purposefully orients itself around the wisdom of what came before. Let us read the great works of the thinkers who have come before, learn their wisdom, appropriate it, and ask those two questions that Bill Gates says are necessary. And once we've appropriated that wisdom, then we say, now how do we apply that wisdom of the ages to our modern day problems? Lastly, classical education provides the emphasis upon deep thinking, problem solving, and creative expression. It's not a coincidence in this regard that many of the most successful technologists, from Mark Zuckerberg to Bill Gates, are classically educated in many ways. In fact, Bill Gates himself said that he believes that his success at Microsoft and thereafter is at least partly attributable to the fact that he was studying Greek philosophers. He doesn't have that, oh, it's old, it must be bad. He says, oh, it's old, let me learn from that wisdom. Why is it that these ones who are massively successful tend to be more classically educated? Because the key to success in technology is really not the mastery of the tools, but a well-cultivated mind. If you have a well-cultivated mind and you learn the tools, you'll be great. If you learn the tools and don't have a well-cultivated mind, you will not. I'll tell you, the thing that I long for the most every day when I'm at work is not, oh, I need somebody who has more years of experience writing code. The thing that I long for on a daily basis is give me a person who penetrates into the problems that we are facing, who can articulate them in a clear way, and then can explain what then should we do and bring people along to do it. That is what a classical education ultimately aims to give you, a flourishing in success and virtue. And if this excites you, you hear this is what you want this for your children, I hope that you will join us at Stella Maris Academy. And with that, I will turn it over for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Greg. We have some questions from listeners. The first question, as a technologist in the field, how would classical education be of help to you in your everyday engineering career? How would it be practically helpful to you?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I mentioned a little bit there the sort of way that this plays out every day. I think the hardest problems that we face in our industry is not how do I write the code? I mean, honestly, we can outsource a bunch of that to other places. The hardest things that we have is actually understanding the nature of the problem that we are dealing with, thinking through it deeply and critically, and then being able to say, how then should we iterate and move forward and try to shape our tools in a better way? In that regard, you know, it amazes me, for instance, even in the technology world, one of the things you really need to be able to do, you need to be able to write. You need to be able to write in a persuasive way that people are going to be able to say, yes, this is in fact a clear description of the problem, and let me move forward. You know, you read some of the things that most of our engineers write, and it's like they brain dumped the totality of everything that was in their head that nobody except for them can understand. Those are the things I want when I'm hiring somebody on my team. I don't want to see like, oh, how great you are at all of your code and all these sorts of things. It's can you work together? Can you analyze the problem? And yes, then you need ability to interact with the tools. But that's table stakes. That's not the thing that makes you like super great.
So I think our viewers were interested in your image of the bike and the child who was running. Isn't classical education like asking our children not to ride the bike, but to run the race because technology is moving so quickly? Don't we need to focus on having children learning technology applications, coding, design tools in class, all of those things?
Yeah, I think that there is a place. You want somebody to be technologically literate. You know, you want to be able to use the technologies that exist. But what you can't do is you can't elevate it to a place where the technology is going to solve the problem for you. You need to get to the place where ultimately you are equipping people to think deeply about problems, to learn from the way historically that the world has approached these problems. One example I might give of that in terms of why it's valuable. You know, a lot of times we talk about Latin in the classical academy. And a lot of people will say, oh, you know, the reason that your kids should learn Latin is because that will give them better SAT scores. They think, well, very utilitarian sort of approach, right? And that's true. There is actually concrete data that says people who know Latin actually perform better in SAT scores. I would say, though, that's not the reason why we teach our children Latin. We teach our children Latin is because it's the key to Western culture. I'll tell you how much riches are hidden from the eyes of everybody because they're locked in Latin. I have had numerous people who go, oh, I wish I could read this thing. And those insights are the things that I think we want to give our children too. And then when you have those insights, you can craft tools in accordance with the way in which we know reality is, and then make progress with it. You need the bike. You can't go, I don't need a bike, let's throw it out. But you got to know, where am I going on the bike? And how is it that I should be pedaling? So you need both in that regard. And education ultimately, you know, should enable you to pick up the skills, but it's not, you don't need classes on this. It's kind of the same, like, you know, 30 years ago, you needed to learn to be able to type on a typewriter. That was important. You could have an elective that says, here's how you type on typewriters, but you don't orient your education around it.
So you mentioned Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. Are there other good examples of classically trained individuals who've been successful engineers or scientists that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, those are the two obvious off the top of my head. I think the thing is that there are many, many people who have been classically educated, who are successful in their field, you know, and aren't, let's put them in the media spotlight per se, right? I can think of numerous people in my work, actually, who, you know, went to a fine liberal arts academy. Actually, there are a bunch of people who write code for Facebook today that have fine arts degrees. You might look at that and you go like, that's really weird. They learned to paint, or they learned to draw, and now they're writing code. Well, look, writing code is the malleable part. It's just another tool. The real thing that you get is, let me have a rich approach for the way in which I learn all the things.
So thinking about the curriculum, integrating STEM with traditional liberal arts subjects seems like a good idea to our viewers, but really how much science, technology, solving engineering problems and mathematics do we envision would be in a classical curriculum for students?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you want to teach people tools in any way that they're doing, right? It's kind of like the same sort of thing when you get to math at a high school level, right? And you're starting to do algebra. Should they have a calculator? Well, yes and no, right? You want to understand the underlying principles, and then along with that, you want to be able to say, and here's how you use the tools to be able to work the things out. I actually think like that's a good example of the sort of way we should integrate these sorts of things. Once you've learned how to do factoring of a polynomial equation, you say, hey, here's an opportunity. Would you like to write a program that will do the factoring for you? If you write that program yourself, I will guarantee you understand the underlying principles, because you can formalize it into something that then can be repeated by a computer. Those are the sorts of things we should be looking for opportunities to integrate, right? Not as a core center thing, but as an augment to say, now how do we build a tool to make the thing that we're talking about work well?
So speaking about technology tools, listeners wonder, what will a Stella Maris Academy technology program look like? Would there be iPads in every classroom? When would the kids use them? When wouldn't they use them?
Yeah, I don't think we have all of the details fully worked out for all of these sorts of things. So if you have strong opinions on it, come and join us and work with us to come out with the right point, right? I think the real thing that we want to say is, it's not a, there are points where it is helpful and there are points where it is harmful. And so, there actually are a good number of studies that we have. Having kids sitting on an iPad while the teacher is teaching can be rather problematic. They're quite distracting. They're all of these sorts of things, right? Do we want them to use it when they're at home and writing a paper? Yeah, probably. So those are the sorts of details that we do need to work out in that.
So we have time for one more question. What advice would you give to a parent with young kids who are intrigued by the program we're putting forward here, but are still struggling because they want their kids to be successful and want to make sure that they're set up well for high school and college and career readiness? What advice would you give them as they're trying to figure out how to make the right choice for their children?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would want to say is, we want to be of help there. We aren't ultimately going to solve those problems for you. We want to be able to work with you to actually facilitate that growth with your children. And so, if this is something you're wrestling with and you'd like to be able to have a conversation on that, I would encourage you, come and talk to us. We can walk through, here's the way we're thinking, this is why we think this is the best, and then wrestle with it together. I truly ultimately believe that the thing that our kids need the most, if they want to be successful in technology, but in every other aspect as well, is the sort of education which Stella Maris is aiming to provide here. One that is grounded in virtue, in tradition, and will equip them to be able to do whatever field they want to work in. But come, have a discussion with us. This is the exact sort of thing that we really want. So I think that we are about out of time here. Thank you guys so much for coming and watching this presentation. We would encourage you to like our Facebook page, follow us on YouTube, come in. And if you would like more information, check out our website, stellamarisSF.org, or place a call to us. Come and talk. We would love to hear from you. Thank you very much for the time that you spent with us today.